Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Line of Sight, a video series where we get into the technical vision behind BitSight products and capabilities. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about control insights, and I'm very happy to introduce Dan Dahlberg, Director of Security Research, who's going to tell us a little bit more about this new capability. So Dan, welcome. Tell us about Control Insights and what it actually is.
Yeah, so Control Insights was a feature that we introduced back in June, and the premise is to offer a different view into the different observables and events that we have in our platform that are specific to cybersecurity risk of organizations, and allow users to be able to understand how they can change or maybe even implement different programs internally to overall improve the efficacy of their security controls.
You were with Tiago, who's one of the original architects of Control Insights, when this whole concept of what ultimately became Control Insights was first talked about. So tell us about that experience, and more importantly, what were you thinking? What were the two of you thinking as that this would do for our customers as you know we brought this capability to market?
Sure. Yeah, so both Tiago and I are security practitioners, and in fact, part of our previous professional experience, we would be considered kind of a core demographic of actually the BitSight product. We would be in organization security teams who would be potentially even using BitSight data to influence changes and to make modifications to programs or different systems respectively. And over time, what Tiago's initial impetus and the reason we sort of initiated discussions is he was recognizing, as well as other folks inside the company, that sometimes users would, for example, only focus on the specific events that we would show on our product. Meaning, we have a whole host of different risk vectors for which we aggregate data. Think of TLS SSL configurations or open ports, for example. And there would be maybe an event that was, hey, an open database. And a user might see that and say, okay, they agree that that shouldn't be publicly exposed, so they would close it. However, just that single action itself doesn't necessarily translate into actual change of behaviors within those security teams. So for example, the next month, there might be yet another database that's reopened, right? Or another one exposed or another system that is on the network perimeter that should not be. And what we felt customers were doing was they're taking this event by event approach rather than trying to understand what caused the event to appear there in the first place, right? So whenever a security team sees one of these situations, they should not only be thinking about remediating it, but really identify what practice either exists or didn't exist that caused it to appear there. So we wanted to start influencing those changes. So Tiago and I had a lot of early discussions around that, and in our one-on-ones, and ultimately it sort of grew into a research project individually. And there was a particular moment where, at that point, it gained a lot of steam. Where we were coming back from the office once. He was driving me to my hotel. And we basically just hung out in the parking lot for about 3 hours talking about and developing this idea, talking about the different advantages and disadvantages about aggregating information, presenting it, what problems are we trying to solve, how should we be presenting it, how can we be expanding it, and various other facets like that.
Tell us how Control Insights actually works.
Sure. Yeah, so you can kind of think of how Control Insights work as almost basically kind of like a pyramid. There's a lot of extrapolation that takes place between the very raw events that we are collecting on a daily, regular basis. Like today, for example, I think we've collected over 2.5 petabytes of different cybersecurity telemetry that we use as the foundation to create our ratings and to create the security reports that we do. You can think of those as like the raw bits and bytes of the raw protocol information that we're collecting. And at that layer, kind of that event layer, we want to translate that into something more meaningful. So I brought up the example of SSL v3 enabled or open ports. That translation happens, so we can actually get some meaningful piece of information from there. But really where Control Insights comes into play is the next layer up, which we call insights. Or excuse me, we call indicators. And what indicators is helping us do is it's taking that given event and extrapolating, as I was mentioning before, what that event is actually implying. What is SSL v3 being enabled implying? What is a self-signed certificate on a given host implying? And we map those to what we call these different indicators, these different implications. And those implications, those indicators, then map to these insights. These are basically conclusions we can make through a combination of different indicators today. So for those that are familiar with our product, in this existing form with the risk vectors, one event is kind of isolated and just manifests itself in one area of the product. There's nothing that kind of combines those different events together into one. With control insights, we can actually take indicators from different events that manifest themselves from different risk vectors to come to some conclusion. So I'll give you an example. Today, one of our risk vectors we have in our platform is compromised systems. This risk vector shows evidence of systems being infected with malware, systems infected with potentially unwanted applications. But we also have another risk vector called desktop software. And this is a risk vector that we actually get visibility into endpoints on these corporate networks. What browser versions they have installed, what operating systems they have installed. We represent this today as measuring whether or not those pieces of software are up to date and have the current patch level, et cetera. But one interesting thing we can do with control insights is we can combine these two pieces of information together and say that if we're seeing a lot of endpoint devices on corporate networks, but we don't see any compromised systems, that's actually a very telling piece of information about the state of the security controls, because those systems are not being actively infected. It's very difficult, of course, to be able to observe every malware on the internet. So having the ability, though, to be able to assess that, we see a collection of endpoint devices, but no malware, gives us, in fact, a positive observation about the state of those controls. And we designed the concept of this feature to be able to allow for easy mapping, not only of our insights to just arbitrary frameworks like these other popular frameworks, but in addition, CAS being the first choice, CAS is also in and of itself a framework that is mapped and can be mapped to other frameworks in and of itself.
So how do companies operationalize control insights? How are they using it? How are they going to really get the best benefit out of it?
Yep, so there's two predominant methods that they can take to operationalize that feature. The first of which is if customers are used to our existing model and how they approach our product in the sense of looking at the different risk vectors, looking at the events, understanding how they're impacting the rating. When they're looking at a given set of events, they can actually begin to understand, okay, what practices and programs could I implement internally within the business to prevent these issues from reoccurring. The second approach is actually taking a controls-based approach. So instead of starting at that event layer, you start by looking at the holistic view of what we're seeing for every individual control. And from there, you can begin to drill down into, okay, what is actually being concluded and what are the events that ultimately ended up with this specific control evaluation of, for example, needing improvement or basically being acceptable. And then begin to make that kind of the way that you understand how to make changes to strategies internally.
As I think about it and I listen to you, this sounds like a continuous controls monitoring capability. Is that an accurate representation?
Correct, exactly. And one thing that users may notice a little bit different about the Control Insights feature is today with our events and our ratings, we are recomputing those daily. We're showing new events daily. We're regularly collecting information and presenting that to customers. With Control Insights, we're actually computing the current state of the controls on a monthly basis. And sort of why do we do this? The reason is because when we are analyzing and assessing those controls for a given period, we don't want to be bringing in historical data with us today because we want to allow customers to readily understand when the improvements that they are making in their programs are manifesting themselves from our observations of the performance of their specific controls. And what users want to be seeing is continuous conclusions that the results of those controls are acceptable, right? And you're not running into situations where you're seeing a set of controls being acceptable 1 month and then needs improvement the next month and acceptable. We don't want to bring in history and have that make it very difficult to understand if a customer makes a change, whether or not that's actually having an impact. So when we're computing the evaluation of that report, we're only using 1 month of data. So we're looking at the current state of the organization over that period of time.
So how do you see Control Insights evolving over the next couple of years?
So it was a feature that we first introduced in June, and we're continuing to invest in that feature and the growth of it. So today, for example, it's already available to all customers of any SPM package. So any user would be able to see how we evaluate their controls based upon everything that we just described today. But there's a lot of opportunity to grow. The first of which was going back to the previous conversation we were having about growth of frameworks. So allowing different views of the conclusions that we're making from our events into the ways that companies already today may be operationalizing their programs. The next biggest thing we, of course, are going to be continuously doing is growing that source of insights, basically allowing us to be making more and more conclusions available, mapping those to the new frameworks, and allowing richer reports for the host of the many different users that we have on our platform, and of course customers that we have today. And notionally, whenever you're positioning cybersecurity telemetry or risk-based information in a controls framework view, that has a lot of other use cases for the many different demographics, audiences of our business beyond just SPM as well. So we hope to see growth in that area too.
So Dan, thank you very much for joining us today. It was very informative. Really appreciate the time. And thank you for joining us today for Line of Sight. And we'll see you on the next episode.